Do you remember the tiny windows conspiracy of 2020? No?
I want to make bigger windows into smaller windows. As far as they're concerned, if you had no window, it would be a lovely thing. This is the craziest plan that anybody has ever seen.
They want to make your windows smaller. That was Donald Trump during the second presidential debate in 2020, attacking Joe Biden's climate change agenda. Now, Biden never proposed making America's windows smaller. That was one of those fever dreams from the mind of Donald Trump. And 3.5 years into the Biden administration, surprise, everybody's windows are exactly the same size. Here's what Biden actually said about his climate plan in that same debate.
We're going to invest in, for example, 50,000 charging stations on our highways so that we can own the electric car market of the future.
Investing in thousands of new EV charging stations. That was the plan. And that is more or less what Joe Biden did as president. He passed a bipartisan infrastructure law with the support of Republicans and Democrats that invested $7.5 billion in charging stations. And the White House tells NBC News that the country is currently on track to hit Biden's charging station goal in 2026, which is 4 years ahead of schedule. America's windows, though, still the same size. The debate that night was a forum where Biden, at least, was explaining what he thought should happen and what he thought was at stake in that 2020 election. The climate stuff was not the only instance of this.
The president also is opposed to Roe v. Wade. That's on the ballot as well in the court. And so that's also at stake right now. And so the election is already begun.
You don't know it's on the ballot. Why is it on the ballot?
Because
why is it on the ballot? It's not on the ballot.
It's on the ballot in the court.
I don't think so.
In the court. Well,
there's nothing happening there.
There's nothing happening there. Take away Roe v. Wade, the justices I appointed would never. Turns out, 2 years later, Trump's appointees to the Supreme Court did exactly that, just as President Biden said they would. Now, to be fair, there were some moments in these debates when Trump also gave us a window, a very tiny window, into what he was going to do, like this one.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups?
What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
Who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and white
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
Donald Trump, when asked to condemn racist hate and militia groups, instead told the right-wing hate groups, the Proud Boys, to stand back and stand by. And sure enough, they did just that. The Proud Boys celebrated Trump's stand back and stand by comments. They ended up leading the attack on January 6th, and the heads of that organization would eventually be charged and convicted of seditious conspiracy for their role in planning and coordinating the January 6th attack. That wasn't the only foreshadowing of chaos that we got in these 2020 debates. Remember that Trump was also asked how he would direct his supporters as ballots were being counted after election night.
Will you urge your supporters to stay calm during this extended period, not to engage in any civil unrest? And will you pledge tonight that you will not declare victory until the election has been independently certified? President Trump, you go first.
I'm urging my supporters to go into the polls and watch very carefully, because that's what has to happen. I am urging them to do it.
Trump was asked if he would urge his supporters to stay calm and not declare victory until all the votes were counted. And Trump did not answer that question directly. We now know that Trump did not wait until all the votes were counted before declaring that the election was rigged and that he was the true winner. And the answer that Trump did give that night, telling his supporters to go into the polls and watch very carefully, that is now official Republican Party policy. Last month, the Trump campaign and the RNC announced a plan to have 100,000 attorneys and volunteers monitor the 2024 vote count. What could go wrong? All of these things are things we learned about at the 2020 debates between Biden and Trump, which brings me to today. For months, it's been an open question whether Trump and Biden would debate each other ahead of November. But then Just a few hours ago, in a rapid public back and forth, Biden and Trump agreed to 2 debates, one on June 27th and one on September 10th, with a vice presidential debate in July. All of this started when President Biden issued this challenge on social media.
Donald Trump lost 2 debates to me in 2020. And since then, he hadn't shown up for debate. Now he's acting like he wants to debate me again. Well, make my day, pal. I'll even do it twice. So let's pick the dates, Donald. I hear you're free on Wednesdays.
That last bit about being free on Wednesdays was a not-so-subtle reference to the former president's New York trial schedule, where court is not in session on Wednesdays. Donald Trump quickly responded to President Biden's challenge during an appearance on conservative talk radio.
President Biden just issued you a debate challenge for June and September with the Veeps talking in July. Do you accept?
Oh, absolutely. I really think he has to debate. He might as well get it over with. Probably should do it early so that he can, he's not going to get any better.
No, but June and September is great.
Every day is a down factor for him.
The campaigns are still hammering out all the details here. And look, anything could happen between now and then. But at this moment, it looks like this thing is happening.
I'm here for the simple reason to show support for a friend.
President Trump is a friend, and I wanted to be here to support him.
I'm here, and all of us are here as friends of Donald Trump.
That was Republican Senator J.D. Vance, Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. They are all part of the gaggle of Republican elected officials who showed up to Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York City this week, all wearing matching outfits and claiming they were just there as friends. But this color-coordinated group of friends wasn't just there in a display of moral support. They were there to hold press conferences and to say stuff like this to the American public.
What's going on inside that courtroom is a threat to American democracy, ladies and gentlemen.
This is a travesty of justice. This is a misuse of the justice system.
This is a sham. This is not the United States of America. This is some third-rate banana republic.
The judicial system in our country has been weaponized against President Trump.
If any of that sounded familiar, it's probably because everything those guys said this week parroted the same disparaging language their friend Donald Trump has been using to demonize the justice system for years now. And that's what makes this group of Republicans and what they did this week so upsetting. Because Trump has already shown us what comments like this can do. Trump demonized prosecutors. His followers threatened them with violence. Trump attacked the FBI. His followers attacked FBI field offices. Trump went after the judges overseeing the cases against him, and those judges saw an unprecedented wave of threats. Back in February, Reuters put out this incredibly comprehensive report on just how many threats judges overseeing Trump cases had been getting. This week, Reuters followed up on that piece, and a new Reuters analysis of Trump's social media posts attacking judges shows us how those posts led to more than 150 calls for violence just since March. In one post, Trump called Judge Juan Merchan a highly conflicted overseer of a kangaroo court. Trump's followers responded with death threats, posts like treason is a hangable offense, and they should all be executed. As Reuters points out, experts on extremism say the constant repetition of threatening or menacing language can normalize the idea of violence and increase the risk of someone carrying it out. And now it's not just Donald Trump who is undermining the judicial system and menacing the people involved in this trial.
Every single person involved in this prosecution is practically a Democratic political operative.
What we've got here is a partisan Democrat district attorney. We have a Biden donor judge.
The only crime that's happening here is this Democrat judge and the Democrat Party prosecuting their political rival.
So corrupt. It's so corrupt, and everybody knows it.
It's so corrupt, and everyone knows it. We know that Trump saying stuff like this is dangerous. So what does it mean now that he is backed by a chorus, a literal chorus of Republican Party leaders amplifying his message? I'd like you to hear something that my colleague Rachel Maddow said last night during our special coverage of Donald Trump's New York criminal trial. It is something that merits repetition.
The rule of law is a specific thing. It is a concrete process where there are people who work in the court system and they have families, and there are people who have to serve as witnesses and jurors in this system. To have every leading light in the Republican Party lining up and saying our judicial system doesn't count and our judicial system is a joke and our judicial system is just stacked against you and me and we should disparage it here. This is an important moment for the rule of law in the United States of America, because this is not Donald Trump inveighing against the judicial system, which is holding him to account. This is the Republican Party, one of the two governing parties of the United States, lining up and in unison saying our court system effectively ought to be dismantled. We're going to look at all of these Republican politicians showing up at the courthouse and denouncing the judicial branch of government as a crucial moment in the fall of American democracy if this proceeds to another Trump presidency.
Joining me now are Katie Benner, New York Times reporter covering the Justice Department, and Charles Coleman, former New York prosecutor and now a civil rights attorney. I had to replay that because I think Rachel is absolutely right, Charles. I don't want to let that moment go yesterday when Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker of the House, is out there saying the whole system is rigged against Donald Trump. On just a basic legal level, it feels like we are kind of barreling towards a constitutional crisis, that the legislative branch is going after the judicial branch. Like, how do we reconcile this?
So much to unpack here. The first thing I want to know is, where was all this vitriol around this Justice Department when it was around prosecuting, or the need to prosecute Hillary Clinton, for example? Where was all this vitriol talking about the two-tiered system of justice when there are conversations about mass incarceration, police abuses, and all other sorts of things that regular people are affected by?
Sure.
These things, in terms of a hypocrisy standpoint, I cannot even begin to touch. But when you're talking about the GOP as a political party, a party allegedly of law and order, we know that that has long since that train has left the station. But when you're talking about a political party that's responsible for upholding American democratic institutions, for you to so aggressively attack one of the institutions that is the bedrock of American society is simply deplorable. Not only does it speak to where you all are as a party, but it lessens the confidence of American citizens in a way that is extremely dangerous for the future of democracy.
Well, and to Rachel's point, this is the beginning maybe of the fall of democracy if Trump was elected for a second presidency. Katie, I up until this point, the DOJ in particular, right, I feel like has tolerated the attacks on it and the broader justice system, and in a way almost kind of, I'm not saying cater to it, but countenanced it in a way that has resulted in, I don't know, Robert Hur getting appointed special counsel to investigate Biden's retention of classified documents. Even some of the Hunter Biden stuff feels, the delay in prosecuting Trump on January 6th, all of it feels of a piece with a justice system that's been a little bit scared to go after conservatives, and look what it's gotten.
I would say a Justice Department that doesn't want to go after conservatives, because to attack one of the two political parties in the country is something that the Justice Department is not supposed to do, and a department that was not built to withstand attacks from within the government. You know, the Justice Department and the rule of law in general work well if everybody wants to support the democracy.
Right.
Democracy is not a noun, it is a verb. You know, we all make it together by looking at the rules and taking them seriously. So no department in the government is going to be able to withstand people throwing out the rule book, which is what we're seeing here. The consequences for the Justice Department, as you point out, the credibility consequences are grave, but also the consequences for us as people, because one of the things the FBI and the National Security Division has brought up again and again over the last few years is the huge uptick in domestic violent extremist activity. And the number 2 category is certainly anti-government extremists. And so this is going to be a big problem, and we're going to see it more and more as we get closer to election.
And the attacks, and just, you know, the integrity of the system and the people inside the system who are tasked with, you know, protecting it and keeping it afloat, which is to say judges, right?
Correct.
Like, from a legal perspective as a lawyer, Charles, when you see the attacks, Donald Trump blows the whistle, Merchan, Engoron, Kaplan, whoever the presiding judge is in any of these trials, then gets a flood of threatening messages from points everywhere. What does that do to a legal system?
It debilitates it in the sense that, number one, you have people who are going to be reticent to actually participate on both sides in terms of professionals who say, I don't want to risk my life or my family's life to participate in this. It's only a job. And if the job is going to cost me my life, no matter how much I believe in law, justice, and what order should look like, I'm not willing to put my safety at risk for that. That's a very big concern. The other concern, Alex, is that from the standpoint of the American people, they can say, why do we need to participate in this system? It's entirely corrupt, which leads to lawlessness, which leads to a space where instead of approaching things where we understand that we have systems that we're supposed to use and rely on to maintain order and law and justice in America, instead of accepting these results from the courts, we have January 6th. We have a level of disruption and a level of disorder that allows for people who are not necessarily able to win the majority to still operate from places of power. And I think that big picture-wise, you have to step back and you have to think about that. When you think about, for example, Donald Trump losing the popular vote twice in the past 2 elections, and yet and still being able to control a narrative that says, well, we're not going to accept that election, regardless of what the courts say. Now that you've sort of denigrated the justice system as a whole, you have more and more and more of your followers who say, I don't have to listen to the courts either, which leads to large senses of unlawfulness across the country, and that's a problem.
Well, I also kind of wonder, to get very tinfoil hat about it, Katie, whether it doesn't have an effect on justices who who are persuaded by Trump's argument. And I am thinking of the Supreme Court, right? If Donald Trump seeks to overturn the 2024 election, the Supreme Court's going to play a role in that. And we have seen a court that really has some justices on it that feel like partisan actors. Are they emboldened to act when they are told over and over again the system is rigged against conservative actors?
Well, I think that we even heard some of those justices who were questioning the D.C. Appeals Court ruling on Trump's immunity talk about how they were not ruling simply on this case, but ruling on something bigger, ruling on democracy, which is actually the opposite of what you're supposed to do when ruling on a case, for one. But two, it shows that many members of that court are cognizant of not just the stakes of the case before them, but something larger. Now, it's clear that there's a big disagreement on the court about what the larger stakes are. You know, for some people it is the letter of the law, and for others it seems to be something amorphous about democracy that we, as people who listen to the argument, couldn't quite get at. And there was a lot of division, but it reflects the same division that's happening in the country.
Exactly.
As people say, what are we to take away from the prosecution of a former president, and what are we to believe? Now, the problem with the violence is that will put an exclamation point on Donald Trump and what he represents. So right now, you're right. Republicans kind of skate through, and they can make these statements, and they can kind of be his mouthpiece outside the court. They can say the things that he's gagged from saying. But if there is violence, and researchers have shown that this kind of rhetoric does often lead to violence in many other circumstances, it certainly did, Charles's point, on January 6th, then we'll have to look at the Republican Party again and say, are you so bought in that you condone even this?
Yeah, well, it's like hopefully we don't get to that point, but it also does seem like the logical endpoint when you have a parade of gentlemen who are in the top echelons of leadership and matching red ties, all saying the same, spreading the same lies effectively.